The first thing anyone noticed that January morning was the chimney. Every cabin in Hollow Ridge sent a thin gray thread of smoke into the winter sky. Every cabin, every stove, every family huddled around whatever heat they could find, feeding fires the way you feed a dying friend. But down in the frozen valley, one house sat silent under a mountain of snow. The Ashcroft farmhouse. No smoke, no footprints, no dog barking, nothing but white stretched wall to wall across the land, as if winter had simply decided to swallow the place whole. High above that valley on a ridge, where the wind cut sideways through the cedar trees, a young woman stepped out of a cave. She paused for just a moment. Then she lifted a short iron digging tool. She drove it into the drift in front of her, and she took a step. The snow came almost to her shoulders. 8 feet of it stood between her and the people who 4 months earlier had prayed she would never survive this mountain. Her name was Elspeth Thorvaldsen. She was 26 years old, and she was on that morning of January the 4th, 1888, the only living soul in Hollow Ridge who was truly warm. If this story finds you today, stay with me all the way to the end. Some journeys begin with betrayal, but where they lead is something no one down in that valley could have imagined. Behind Elspeth, at the mouth of the cave, a fire still burned. It burned low and steady the way she had learned to keep it. The heavy log wall she had built across the entrance still stood strong, cedar dark against the pale stone. Smoke drifted up in a slow thin ribbon and disappeared into the cold. Beside her, a red-brown collie waited in the snow. His name was Copper. His breath came in soft clouds. He watched her face the way he had watched her face every day for 4 years, since the afternoon she found him half frozen in an alley in Cincinnati. She looked down at him. She said his name quietly. Copper stepped forward ready. Together, the woman and the dog began the long walk down the mountain. Nobody in Hollow Ridge knew yet that she was coming. Nobody knew yet what she carried in her chest. 4 months earlier, when the leaves still hung red and gold on the oaks, nobody in this valley had believed that this cave could hold a life. If you have ever been told you were less than you truly were, and you kept going anyway, do me a small favor before we go on. Type the word standing in the comments. I want to know you're here. Now let me take you back. Back to a green April in Ohio. Back to the young woman before she was a widow. Elspeth Thorvaldsen was born in Cincinnati in the winter of 1861 in a small brick row house near the river. Her father Sten was a Norwegian carpenter who had come across the ocean at 17 with nothing but a leather satchel of tools and the address of a cousin who was already dead by the time he arrived. Her mother, Ingeborg, died bringing Elspeth's brother into the world when Elspeth was only 8. The baby died too. That was the first quiet grief of her life, and she carried it in her chest the way you carry a smooth river stone in your pocket. You forget it is there until you reach for something else. After that, it was her father and her grandfather, Bjorn. Bjorn Thorvaldsen was a broad, silver-bearded old man from a place called Telemark in the mountains of Norway. He had spent his young years working the limestone mines above Rjukan, breaking stone by lantern or light in the deep dark. Then he came to America and worked wood instead, but he never lost his love of stone. He would take Elspeth on Sunday walks along the river bluffs and tap the limestone with the head of his walking stick and say in his slow, careful English, "Stein husker sommeren." Stone remembers summer. She was small then and did not understand. He would smile. He would say it again. "You will understand, little one day." Bjorn had a leather-bound journal thick with pages. On winter evenings by the coal stove, he would draw for her diagrams of Norwegian farm buildings buried into hillsides, diagrams of stone byres where the cows stayed warm through polar nights, diagrams of a limestone mine tunnel where the temperature, he told her, was the same in July and in January. He wrote the numbers down. 54 degrees, year-round. Deep enough into the earth, he told her, and the world forgets its own seasons. She was 14 when he died in his sleep. She was 19 when a splintered log at the sawmill killed her father. She was 22 when she found copper. She was 24 when the letter came from Missouri. The letter was written in a careful, tall handwriting. It was signed Nathaniel Ashcroft. He said he had heard of her through the Norwegian Lutheran congregation. He said he was a farmer in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri. He said he was 29 years old, unmarried and lonely. He said he did not wish to promise more than a good, honest life on good, honest land. He wrote to her once a month, then twice. Then she found herself writing back and finding in her own words a woman she had almost forgotten she could be. The exchange went on for nearly 2 years. In April of 1887, she stepped off a train in a little Missouri town called Berryman's Crossing, carrying a wooden trunk, a Norwegian Bible her mother had brought over the ocean, her grandfather's leather journal, and a red-brown collie who sat at her feet with the calm dignity of a small ambassador. Nathaniel Ashcroft was waiting on the platform. I was tall. He was thin. He was thinner than his letters had suggested. When he smiled, she noticed that the smile did not quite reach his eyes. She noticed the small red stain at the corner of his handkerchief when he coughed into it. She noticed, but she said nothing. Because a woman traveling alone across half a country does not turn back at the sight of a handkerchief. They were married 9 days later in a small white church with only Nathaniel's parents in the pews. Silas Ashcroft, his father, was a large, silver-haired man with the hands of someone who had once worked much harder work than farming. He watched her the way a merchant watches a bolt of cloth being unrolled. Cordelia Ashcroft, his mother, was small and neatly dressed with a face like a locked drawer. Neither of them embraced her. Nathaniel took her hand at the altar. His palm was warm, too warm. She knew then that he was very ill. She did not run. She stayed. For 5 months she stayed. She learned the farmhouse and the fields and the slow rhythm of an Ozark summer. She learned to bring cool water up from the spring. She learned to keep the shutters closed against the afternoon heat. She learned most of all to nurse a man who was dying slowly and who was trying very hard not to show her how quickly he was going. Copper never left Nathaniel's bedside. Some days in the worst of the coughing, when Elspeth's arms could hold nothing more, the dog would climb up and lie across Nathaniel's feet, and Nathaniel would close his eyes and smile as if a small, warm miracle had just happened. That dog knows more than any doctor, Nathaniel whispered once. He knows what matters, Elspeth said. Then it was October, and Nathaniel was too weak to sit up, and she knew that the leaves outside his window would fall before he did. On the night before he died, he asked her to come close. She sat on the edge of the bed. He held her hand with both of his. He said, Elspeth, I have to tell you something, and I am asking you to forgive me before I say it. She waited. He said, my parents did not want a daughter-in-law. They wanted a nurse. They needed someone who would come and stay and not ask a price. My father wrote your name down when he heard of you from the pastor. He told me to write to you. He told me what to say. She did not move. He said, but Elspeth, Elspeth, please listen to this next part. I read your letters, every one. I read them until I knew your handwriting the way I knew my mother's voice. And somewhere in the middle of those 2 years, I stopped writing what my father wanted me to write. I started writing what I meant. By the time you stepped off that train, I was not lying to you anymore. Do you understand what I am telling you? I loved you. Really, truly, not because I needed you, because you were you. Her chest broke open at that, quietly, without a sound. He said, but my parents don't know. My parents will never believe it. And when I am gone, they will try to send you away. You must know this. You must be ready. She said, I am ready. He said, there is one more thing. I wrote you a letter, a real one, from me, not from the son my father raised. It is in the middle drawer of the writing desk, under the false bottom. My mother does not know that drawer has a false bottom. Only my brother Wesley knows. Nobody else in this house. When you can, when it is safe, look for it. Read it. Promise me. She promised. He died the next morning at the hour when the light first comes gray through the window. Copper lay across his feet and would not move for a long time. That was the first great turn of Elspeth Thorvaldsen's life on that mountain. But it was not the last. The funeral was small. The valley people came because in a small town, people come to funerals, but they left quickly. Cordelia did not cry where anyone could see. Silas stood at the graveside with his hands clasped behind his back like a man overseeing the unloading of a wagon. 3 days after they buried Nathaniel, Silas called Elspeth into the parlor. Cordelia was already there. There was a paper on the table. Silas said, this land, this house, and everything in it belongs to the Ashcroft family. My son married you in good faith, but my son is dead. We owe you nothing. However, in the memory of my son, I am willing to make a small allowance. You have 5 acres on the North Ridge. There is a cave up there. It has a spring inside. It has a natural chimney. You will find it perfectly adequate for a person of your habits. He slid the paper toward her. He said, you may sign this now or you may take the next stage back to Ohio. Either way, you will be off this porch by Sunday. Elspeth said quietly, Nathaniel spoke to me before he died. He said there were papers of mine in his writing desk. Cordelia's face changed just for a moment, just enough. Elspeth turned toward the hall, but Cordelia was already standing. Cordelia said, there is nothing in this house that belongs to you. Elspeth walked into Nathaniel's room anyway. She went to the writing desk. She pulled open the top drawer where Nathaniel had kept the pile of 2 years of letters and the small tin-type photograph she had sent him. And she knew a foolish little poem he had once written for her and read aloud in the parlor. The top drawer was empty. The bottom of the drawer was still faintly warm. She turned around. Cordelia was standing in the doorway. Cordelia said, whatever my son gave you in a moment of weakness, I have taken back for the family. There were letters. Yes. There were papers. Yes. There was a photograph. There was, God help him, a foolish little poem. There is nothing left of any of it. I burned it all. This morning, in the kitchen stove. Now you go up that mountain or you go back to Ohio. But you leave my son's memory alone. Elspeth said nothing. She did not open the middle drawer. She did not want Cordelia to see her check it. She only bowed her head and stepped past the older woman and went up the stairs. She would think in the weeks and months to come about the strange fact that Cordelia had listed everything she had burned in careful order. Letters, papers, a photograph, a poem. But she had not mentioned any last letter. Any letter dated in October. Any letter that Nathaniel might have written on his final night. Perhaps she thought Cordelia had not found one. Perhaps someone else had gotten to that drawer first. She packed her trunk that afternoon. Silas would not lend her a wagon. He said she could take what she could carry. She could carry the trunk. She could carry a black iron cooking pot her grandfather had bought her when she left Cincinnati. She could carry her mother's Bible. She could carry her grandfather's journal. She could carry 3 blankets, a tin cup, a knife, a small store of dry beans, a bag of cornmeal, and copper walking at her heel. That was everything. Silas walked her up to the ridge himself. Cordelia came a few paces behind. They said nothing to her. They said nothing to each other. The cave sat in the side of the hill, about half a mile above the farmhouse, in a place where the limestone came out of the earth like the shoulders of some enormous, sleeping thing. There was a spring inside. There was a rough, natural chimney at the back where the smoke could rise. There was a floor of dry clay. The entrance was wide. The wind moved through it freely even on a mild October afternoon. Silas stopped at the mouth. He said, you will find, Elspeth, that in a difficult season, a person's pride will not keep her alive. If you find yourself unable to bear the winter, you may come to the house. You may apologize, and there will be a place for you. There is, even if you are practical, my other son Wesley, who is of a marrying age. That is my last mercy to you. Consider it. She looked at him. She said quietly, you will see, Mr. Ashcroft. You will see. He blinked. He had not expected that. He turned. He walked down the hill. Cordelia followed. They did not look back. Elspeth stood at the mouth of the cave with Copper beside her. She listened to their footsteps fade into the fallen leaves. Then she carried her trunk inside. The cave was cold, but it was not as cold as she had expected. She reached out and laid her palm flat against the limestone wall. The stone was cool, not warm, but not cold either. Steady. She stood there with her hand on the rock. She thought of her grandfather Bjorn. She thought of the mine tunnel he had drawn for her. She thought of the number he had written down in his careful hand. 54 degrees, year-round. She whispered in Norwegian, Bestefar, du hadde rett. Grandfather, you were right. Copper watched her with his patient brown eyes. She lit a very small fire that first night in the natural chimney at the back. She sat cross-legged with a blanket around her shoulders, and she opened her grandfather's journal on her knees. She read by the light of the small flame. She read the pages about limestone. She read the pages about the winter byres of telemark built into hillsides so that the family cows would not freeze. She read the pages about a technique her grandfather called door control. Door control. The idea that the mouth of a shelter, not its size, determines its warmth. She read until her eyes burned. Then she blew out the fire because she had very little wood, and she lay down on the clay floor with her trunk for a pillow and copper pressed warm against her back. She did not weep. She thought instead of Nathaniel's hand in hers the night before he died, she thought, I am ready, and she slept. The next morning, she walked into the woods to find a man she had heard of only once. His name was Obadiah Finch. The neighbors called him the old hermit up on Beecher's Knob. They said he was 78 years old or 80 or 90, depending on who was telling. They said he had come into these hills as a young man during the war between the states and had never come back down. They said he knew things the valley had long since forgotten. She found his cabin among the oldest oaks she had ever seen. He was on the porch mending a steel trap. He did not look up. He said, "You slept in the cave." She stopped. She said, "How did you know?" He worked the pin of the trap with his gnarled fingers. He said, "Because you have the look of somebody the stone has begun to teach." He raised his eyes then, blue eyes faded but very sharp. He said, "You touched the wall, didn't you?" She nodded. "It's warmer than it should be," she said. He barked out a small dry laugh. "No, ma'am," he said. "It's exactly as warm as it ought to be. The mountain remembers summer long after the people forget." She sat down on the porch steps slowly. She opened her grandfather's journal. She showed him the diagram of the telemark buyer. He looked at it for a long time. He did not read Norwegian, but he understood a drawing when he saw one. He looked up at her. He said, "Ma'am, your grandpa knew things this whole county has forgotten. Where'd he come from?" "Norway," she said. He nodded once, as if that explained everything. Then he said something that changed the shape of her world. He said, "I know that cave. I know it better than Silas Ashcroft would want me to, because I dug in it. 19 years old I was, 18 and 59. I was working for a man named of Ashcroft out of Rolla, Silas's daddy. Silas was a boy then, and that man Silas's daddy, he was mining limestone out of that ridge. There's an old shaft. There's a shelf near the back. There is a reason the cave has a spring and a natural flue. It was worked. It was worked hard." She stared at him. She said, "But Silas said." "Silas said what he wanted to say," Obadiah said. "Silas Ashcroft was a limestone man before he was a farmer. He knows what that cave can do in winter. He knows exactly what it can do. He sent you up there, ma'am, not to kill you. He sent you up there to break you. He wanted you to come stumbling down that hill, half starved, half frozen, so he could stand on his porch and refuse you in front of the whole valley. He wanted a public unmaking. That was his plan. I'd stake my last dollar on it." Elspeth sat very still. Copper at her feet pressed his shoulder against her boot. She said quietly, "Then he will be disappointed." Obadiah looked at her a long moment. Then he smiled, a slow, dry mountain smile. He said, "Ma'am, if you mean that I will teach you everything I know, not for pity, I don't have any pity in me at my age. I'll teach you because I want to be alive on the day Silas Ashcroft learns that his daughter-in-law took the very stone he tried to bury her under and built with it a place warmer than his own house." She reached out. She shook his hand. He said, "First thing tomorrow, we take axes to the cedars. That mouth is too wide. We are going to teach that cave to hold a summer." She walked back down the ridge at twilight with Copper at her heel and something new burning quietly in her chest. Not hope exactly. She had learned to be careful with the word hope. Something more practical than hope. A plan, 3 weeks. That's how long it took working from dawn to dusk to change the cave from what it was into what it needed to be. Have you ever built something with your bare hands out of nothing but what the ground was willing to give you? If you have, you already know. It doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen clean. And it doesn't happen alone in the way people think. Every morning before the sun was over the ridge, Elspeth was walking the cedar groves with Obadiah Finch and an axe her grandfather had once used to trim maple wood on a Cincinnati porch. Obadiah taught her to read the trees. He would run his palm along a young cedar's bark and say, "This one's twisted at the heart. She'll split ugly. Leave her." He would put his hand on another and say, "This one's straight through. She wants to be lumber. Take her." He taught her to notch. He taught her to swing an axe from the shoulder and not from the wrists. He taught her to let the weight of the axe head do the work so a woman of 120 pounds could bring down a tree that a man of 200 would call a day's labor. By the end of the first week, her palms were nothing but blisters and blood. She wrapped them in strips torn from an old muslin apron. She kept swinging. By the end of the second week, they had felled 47 cedars. By the end of the third week, they had built the wall. It was a beautiful thing, that wall, if you had eyes to see it. Cedar logs stacked horizontally tight and square, filling the wide mouth of the cave from floor almost to ceiling. In the very center of it, they left a door. Just a doorway, 3 feet and 2 inches wide. Low enough that a tall man would duck. Small enough that the wind, when it came, would find no easy way in. Obadiah stood back on the morning they placed the last log. He looked at what they had made. He said, "In Norway you called it what now?" Elspeth said, "Door control." He said the word carefully. He didn't quite get the sound of it right. He said, "That's a good word, door control. The size of the door decides the size of the winter." Between every log they packed a mixture of stream clay and moss. The moss came from the north side of the fallen oaks near Obadiah's cabin. He told her the moss had a spring to it. When the clay dried and shrank, the moss would push back out and fill the crack. "The old-timers knew," he said. "They knew 100 things we forgot." Then in front of the doorway on the outside, they laid a curved arc of flat limestone slabs. 14 of them, each about the size of a large loaf of bread. They set them close to there, curving outward from the door like the palm of an open hand. He said, "Fire goes out here, not inside. You burn your wood outside. The flames heat these stones. These stones hold the heat. All night long while you sleep, the stones are still handing warmth to the cave." She wrote it all down that evening in the back of her grandfather's journal. She wrote cedar wall complete, door 3 feet 2 inches wide, clay and moss chinking, limestone hearth outside, 14 slabs, cave interior at 54 degrees this morning, outside was 34. She underlined the numbers. She fell asleep with the pencil in her hand. By the end of that first week of November, the whole valley knew what she was doing up there. The first one to climb up was a young farmer named Caleb Monroe. He was 24 years old with a serious face and dark hair that fell into his eyes when he took off his hat. He came up the ridge one afternoon with a covered basket. He said, "Ma'am, my mother baked bread." She said no soul should face winter without bread. Elspeth invited him to sit by the outside fire. She brewed a small cup of chicory in her black iron pot. Caleb Monroe sat quietly and watched her. He watched Copper, who had come up to sniff his boots and then settled with quiet approval by his knee. He watched the cedar wall. He watched the curve of limestone by the fire. He said, "Ma'am, I have not seen anything like this before." "Most people haven't," she said. He said, "May I?" She nodded. He stepped inside. He stood there for a long time. When he came back out, his face was different. He was a man who had just been shown a thing that his father and his father's father had never bothered to notice. He said, "It's warmer in there than in my mother's kitchen." She smiled. She said, "It has been warmer than my mother-in-law's parlor since October." He laughed once quietly. Then his face closed. He said, "Ma'am, I would like to come back. I would like to help, if you'd have me." She said, "Caleb Monroe, you would be welcome." He walked back down the mountain with the empty breadcloth folded under his arm. He did not come back. Not the next day, not the day after. She learned later that Silas Ashcroft had walked into the Monroe farmyard on the evening of Caleb's visit. She learned that Silas had put his hand on the shoulder of Caleb's father, a small, tired man named Ephraim, and said in that soft, reasonable voice of his, "I would hate for the Monroe seed account to be closed at the Mercantile this spring. I truly would, but we have to be careful, all of us, about which sort of person we lend our name to, don't we, Ephraim?" That was all Silas had needed to say. Ephraim Monroe had spoken to his son that same night. Caleb Monroe did not walk up that ridge again for 2 months. The next visitor was Reverend Josiah Pembroke. He was a broad, white-haired man with the kind of certainty that comes to a preacher who has never in his life been in the position of doubting himself. He climbed the ridge on the second Sunday of November after his sermon. He was still in his black frock coat. He was breathing hard by the time he reached the mouth of the cave. He looked at the cedar wall. He looked at the limestone hearth. He looked at Elspeth. He said, "Sister Ashcroft." She said, "Reverend." He said, "I have come to speak plainly to you as a shepherd to a lost sheep." Copper stood up, just stood. He did not growl. He simply put himself very quietly between the Reverend and Elspeth. The Reverend said, "This is old country work. This is the work of the Norse pagans who lived in the earth like animals. This is not Christian shelter. My advice to you, sister, in the memory of your late husband, is to come down the mountain Take the guest room the Ashcrofts have offered you, and let the Almighty Lord provide warmth through the proper means. A stove, a roof, a hearth in a Christian home. She waited until he was finished. She said, Reverend Pembroke, my grandfather Bjorn was baptized in a Lutheran church older than this county. He taught me what he knew about limestone, the same way your grandfather taught you what he knew about Scripture. I do not believe the Lord objects to a woman using the knowledge her elders gave her to keep herself alive. His mouth went thin. He said, I will pray for you. He turned and walked down the mountain in his good black coat. That Sunday from his pulpit, he told his congregation that the widow Ashcroft was practicing old country superstition in the hills above their town, and that no Christian in Hollow Ridge should feel obligated to give her aid. The pews were quiet. Nobody argued. Silas Ashcroft in the second row folded his large hands in his lap and looked at the floor as if he was suppressing a satisfied smile. Do you know what it costs to be spoken about that way, from a pulpit in a small town where you have no one? If you do, then I don't have to explain. And if you don't, please, before we go on, believe me when I tell you that it is one of the loneliest feelings a person can carry. If Elspeth's quiet strength is beginning to mean something to you, do her a small kindness and put the word mercy in the comments. She could not read it. But sometimes telling a good story out loud to other good people is a form of prayer for the woman it happened to. Now, let me tell you about the man who came next. His name was Bartholomew Crane. He was a builder out of St. Louis with a paper certificate that said he had studied engineering at a small college in Illinois. Silas Ashcroft, being a careful man, had paid Bartholomew Crane $15 in expenses to come out to Hollow Ridge for one day, examine the cave on the ridge, and produce a written report on why it would collapse. Bartholomew Crane arrived on the third Saturday of November, dressed in a wool overcoat, too good for the country, and a pair of city boots that were not up to the ridge trail. He climbed the hill with Silas walking behind him at a respectful distance like a proud patron. Elspeth was chinking the last of the log gaps when they arrived. She stood up. She wiped her hands on her apron. Bartholomew Crane looked at the wall. He looked at the door. He looked at the arc of limestone. He looked at the natural chimney at the back of the cave, faintly visible through the open door. He took out a small brass measuring tape. He measured the door. He measured a log. He tapped one of the limestone slabs with the toe of his good boot. He said without looking at her, Madam, I have built 40 houses. I have never built a cave. There is a reason for that. She said nothing. He said limestone dwellings as documented since the Romans are subject to seasonal shift. Your log wall will move a full 3 inches in the first hard freeze. The clay chinking will crack. Your ceiling, ma'am, is unsupported. In February, when the water in the micro cracks of that ceiling freezes and expands, you will lose a rock. It may not be a big rock. It may be. If it lands where you are sleeping, it will kill you. She waited. He said, This is my professional opinion, given without malice. I would advise you to abandon this project and go down the mountain. Winter is nearly here. She looked at him. I said, Mr. Crane, my grandfather worked 22 years in a Norwegian limestone mine that had been in use for 300 years. Not one man died of a rockfall in his time there. Not one. Because he and the men before him knew how to read the stone. I have read this ceiling. It is dry, hard limestone, ma'am, forgive me. Sir. It has not shed a rock in 150 years of storms. It will not shed a rock this February. He raised his eyebrows. Silas, standing behind him, laughed. Just a small, surprised laugh. Bartholomew Crane said quietly, You will see, madam. She looked directly at him. She said, You will see, Mr. Crane. Then she went back to chinking her wall. I and Silas walked down the ridge. That night at the tavern in Berryman's Crossing, Bartholomew Crane, over a glass of whiskey, he did not pay for, told any man who would listen that the widow up on Ashcroft's Ridge had built her own grave and was too proud to see it. That was the night the wagers began. By Thanksgiving, there was a slate behind the bar at the tavern, written on it in white chalk in a neat hand, Widow Ashcroft, bets accepted, odds she quits and returns to Ohio by Christmas even. By January the 1st, 2-1. By the 1st of February, 5-1. That she stays through the winter without asking for help, 15-1. Wesley Ashcroft, Nathaniel's younger brother, age 22, put down $1 on Christmas. He said loud enough for everyone to hear, My sister-in-law is a proud woman. She'll break before the snow does. 23 men in that tavern took the wager one way or the other. Elspeth learned about the slate from Obadiah, who came up the mountain a few days later with the news sour on his tongue. He said, "You should know what they are doing down in there." She listened. She kept working. She said only, "Let them wager." She did not say the rest of what she was thinking, which was that she had in her 26 years been underestimated by better men than the ones in that tavern and had outlasted them all. On the last Sunday of November, in the small hours of the morning, Copper woke Elspeth with a low, uncertain sound in his throat. Not a bark, a question. She sat up. He was standing at the doorway. He was looking outside. She got out of the blankets. She wrapped the wool shawl around her shoulders. She went to the door. The night was clear. A thin dusting of new snow lay across the ledge outside the cave. The stars were sharp. There were footprints in the fresh snow. They started about 10 feet from the doorway where a person would have first come into view around the shoulder of the ridge. They walked in a slow, hesitating lineup to within 4 feet of the cedar wall. There they stopped. There they stood for what must have been several minutes, judging by the depth of the two boot prints that had settled in place. Then they turned. Then they walked back the way they had come down the ridge toward the valley. The prints were narrow, city boots, not Obadiah's heavy work boots, not Caleb Monroe's honest farm boots. Elspeth stood in her doorway and looked at those prints for a long time. She thought of many possibilities. Silas, come to look. But Silas walked with a heavier tread. Bartholomew Crane come back to make more measurements. But he had already gone home to St. Louis. Someone from the tavern come to see the widow he had wagered against. Possibly, she did not know. Copper stood beside her. He did not growl. Whatever the stranger had been, the dog had not felt danger. Elspeth went back inside. She banked the fire. She lay down. She did not sleep for a long time. She did not know then that she would learn who those footprints belonged to. Only in the middle of the great storm, more than 5 weeks later, in the parlor of the very house where the man himself had grown up. The first week of December brought the first true test. A cold front swept down from the north, and for 2 days the temperature at night dropped to 8 degrees below zero. The wind on the ridge came screaming out of the northwest, and the tops of the cedars bent like penitents. Elspeth spent the whole of the first night walking the inside of her wall, by candlelight, running her fingers along every joint. She found a crack, one crack near the top of the doorframe, where the clay had shrunk and the moss had not fully filled it, a finger-width gap through which the wind was reaching in and touching her cheek. She could feel the cold coming through it like a knife. She had to go outside. At midnight, in 8 below zero, she wrapped herself in every blanket. She took a small tin of clay she had kept in the corner. She warmed it over the fire. She stepped out into the wind. The cold hit her like a wall of iron. Her fingers went stiff in less than a minute. She could not see the fire behind her because the wind was whipping the smoke sideways. Copper stood at the doorway and barked once, sharp and clear. That bark saved her. She realized she had already in only 3 steps lost the sense of which direction the door was. She turned toward the bark. She could just make out the shape of him against the firelight. She followed him back to the doorway. She stood in the doorway with her hands shaking. She made herself warm the clay again. She stepped up on a stool. She pressed the clay into the finger-width gap. She smoothed it with the palm of her stiff, aching hand. And she did not step outside again that night. In the morning, the wind died. The sky went pale blue. She measured her ceiling temperature with the sensitivity of her cheek. She wrote in her journal, interior 58 degrees, exterior -8, differential 66 degrees, chinking held after repair. Copper is a good dog. Down in the valley, the same night a man named Harlan Voss lost 2 toes to frostbite, trying to bring in a cow from a pasture. Down in the valley, the Halloway family's back porch pipe froze and burst. Down in the valley, Silas Ashcroft, in his farmhouse, went through most of a cord of firewood, keeping his own parlor at a comfortable temperature. Nobody in the valley yet understood the size of what was coming. Only Elspeth did. Because on the same night she repaired her chinking out on the ridge just before dawn, when the wind had died and everything had gone still, she stepped outside for a moment to feel the air. Copper came out with her. He stood very still. He did not sniff the ground. He did not turn his head. He faced the western sky, and he did not move. She followed his gaze. The stars were sharp as knife points all across the eastern half of the sky. But to the west above the Boston Mountains, there was a dark, low band of cloud that swallowed the stars along its edge. It moved as she watched, slowly, steadily, toward her. She thought of Obadiah's voice 3 days earlier, saying, "When the birds go quiet and the wind dies at the same time, that ain't a normal storm. That's the killer, the silent one." Last time she came through in 56, she took 200 souls before she was done. There were no birds calling. The wind had died. Elspeth stood on that ridge with her dog and looked at the western sky. She did not know yet that the storm still lay 10 days away. She did not know that a very great many people would soon depend, without knowing it, on the work of her hands. But she knew this. Something enormous was coming. She turned. She went inside. She began quietly to count her firewood. "You are with me, I hope, on this ridge. If you are, do me a favor. Tell somebody who lives alone this winter that you love them. Tell them today." Elspeth had no one to call. "You do. Now let me take you the rest of the way. Let me show you what came out of the mountains and what stood up to meet it." The storm came 10 days later. It came on the 31st of December, 1887, at 3 in the morning, just as Obadiah Finch had predicted. He had been dead by then for 9 days. He had gone to sleep on the 22nd of December in his own cabin with his hand on the leather journal Elspeth had lent him, and he had not woken up. She had found him on the 23rd. She had washed his face herself. She had wrapped him in his best wool blanket. She had dug a grave under the tallest oak on his own land because the ground on the ridge was too frozen, and the ground by the church was not somewhere he would have wanted to be. She had said the Norwegian burial words her grandfather had said over her mother. She had buried him with the journal in his hand. She had come home to the cave alone. Then she had waited 9 days. On the night the storm came, she had already brought inside every stick of firewood she owned. She had already sealed the doorway with an extra layer of moss. She had already filled the black iron pot with a stew of dried beans and the last of the salt pork. Copper was asleep, curled tight at the foot of her blankets. She was reading by the light of a small tallow candle when the wind changed. It did not begin with sound, it began with silence. The steady, small, constant noises of the winter night, the click of ice in the trees, the far-off call of an owl, the soft settling of snow on the ledges. All of them stopped at once, as if the whole world had inhaled at the same moment. Elspeth sat up. Copper opened his eyes. Then the wind arrived. It hit the ridge with the roar like a train. It was not gusting. It was continuous. The cedar wall shuddered, a fine white powder of snow, driven under enormous pressure through the tiny gaps between the logs, hissed into the cave like steam from a kettle. The candle guttered but did not blow out. Elspeth got up. She walked along the wall. She listened to each joint. Everyone held. She went back to her bed. She sat down. She began very quietly to sing an old Norwegian lullaby her mother had sung her when she was very small. She sang because she needed the sound of a human voice in the cave to make the storm seem smaller. Copper pressed against her thigh. She sang until her voice went hoarse. Then she was silent. The wind blew for 4 days. 4 days, 96 hours. The temperature outside, according to the small thermometer she had nailed to a cedar pole just beyond the doorway, sank to 20 below zero on the second night. Then 30. Then at the coldest, in the pre-dawn hours of the fourth day, the mercury reached the bottom of the tube and stopped. She did not know what the true temperature was. She only knew it was colder than anything the thermometer could measure. Inside the cave, the temperature held. She wrote in her journal every morning by candlelight. Day 1. Interior 49 degrees. Firewood at 3/4. Copper sleeping, wall solid. Day 2. Interior 46 degrees. Firewood at half, wall solid. Day 3. Interior 44 degrees. Firewood at 1/3. I banked the outside fire smaller to conserve. Wall solid. Day 4. Interior 42 degrees. Firewood at 1/4. Wall solid. I have been thinking of Nathaniel today. He would have loved this cave. He would have said, "See, Ellie, I told you the mountain would keep you." Nobody down in the valley was writing in a journal that week. Down in the valley, 3 families lost their roofs on the second night. The Holloway house lost the entire west wall to a wind that no living person in Hollow Ridge had ever felt before. Prudence Holloway, wrapped in every blanket she owned, huddled with her husband and two daughters in the pantry, which was the only room still standing. Not a mile from the Halloways, Reverend Josiah Pembroke, walking the 40 yards from his own back door to the woodshed, on the morning of the second day was blown down twice. He crawled the last 10 yards. When he made it back inside with an armful of split oak, he was missing all sensation in three of his fingers. He would lose the tips of two of them in the weeks that followed. And in the small back room of Silas Ashcroft's own farmhouse, a young man named Wesley. Ashcroft sat by a window with a bottle of his father's whiskey he had not been given permission to open. He was 22 years old, and that night he was more frightened than he had ever been in his life, because the chimney of the great front parlor had been blocked by snow on the second day, and Silas in his pride had refused to say the word help aloud to any of them, because Silas had misjudged the winter, because Silas had ordered a smaller cord of wood than usual back in September, believing that a mild winter was coming, because there was, as of the fourth day of the storm, about half a day's firewood left in the whole Ashcroft farmhouse. And because Wesley, in the quiet of that dark room, was thinking of things that only he knew. Wesley Ashcroft had a secret. The secret was that on the last Sunday of November, in the small hours of the morning, he had climbed the ridge. He had done it alone. He had not told his father. He had not told his mother. He had left the house at 2 in the morning and walked in city boots because they were the quietest up the North Trail. He had stood outside the cedar wall of the cave. He had put his hand on the log wall. He had felt the warmth in it. He had stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, unable to decide whether to knock. Then at last he had turned and walked back the way he had come. He had told himself all the way down the hill that he had gone up there to prove his father right, to laugh at whatever half-built folly the widow was creating. But the truth he could not admit even to himself was that he had gone up because he was afraid. Afraid of the winter his father was pretending would not come. Afraid because he, unlike his father, still remembered his brother Nathaniel. Afraid because Nathaniel, in the last week of his life, in a moment when their parents were out of the room, had whispered to Wesley, "If Ma and Pa turn on Elspeth, and they will, Wesley, they will, then you protect her. You hear me? She is the only person on this mountain who will know how to live through what's coming. Read our grandfather Bjorn's journal if you don't believe me. She is the one who knows." Wesley had also promised his brother something else that night. Nathaniel, coughing between the words, had said, "Wesley, there is a letter in the middle drawer of the writing desk, under the false bottom. I wrote it for her. If Ma gets to that desk before Elspeth does, that letter is ash. You have to be the one who saves it. You have to be the one who puts it in her hand. Promise me." And Wesley had promised. And Wesley, that same night after his brother had died, had gone to the desk and lifted the false bottom, and found the letter, and taken it, and hidden it in a hollowed-out place behind a loose board in his own bedroom, where his mother would never look. And then Wesley had done nothing. For 3 months he had done nothing. Han had walked past that loose board every morning and every night, and he had not opened it, and he had not brought the letter to the ridge, and he had walked into the tavern instead, and in front of 20 men had wagered $1 that his brother's widow would be dead or gone by Christmas. He had done it because his father was watching. He had done it because he was a coward. And now, on the fourth night of the great storm, Wesley Ashcroft sat by the window of the dark parlor, listening to his father's shallow, cold-sick breathing in the chair by the empty fireplace, and he understood with a kind of quiet horror that the woman he had bet against was probably the only person in the entire county who was not at this moment freezing to death. He put the bottle down. He whispered to no one, "Forgive me, Nate." On the morning of the fifth day, the storm broke. The wind did not stop all at once. It faded over the course of an hour from a roar to a moan to a long, hushed silence. The last of the snow drifted down in slow, feathering spirals. The sky went pale. Elspeth waited another full hour before she opened the door. She had to shove it hard. It moved 4 inches. 6. 8. Snow poured in around her boots. She pushed again. The door came open enough that she could squeeze through. She stepped out into a world without edges. Every tree was a white column. Every rock was a white mound. The path she had trodden 1,000 times down to the spring was gone. The limestone hearth was gone. The cedar wall stood dark against the white, but a drift on its south side reached almost to the top of the door. She looked down into the valley. She could see from her ridge the whole of Hollow Ridge spread beneath her, buried and glittering in the morning sun. Thin gray threads of smoke rose from most of the chimneys. Not all of them, but most, except one. The chimney of the Ashcroft farmhouse was dark. She stood very still. She looked at it for a long time. Copper came out beside her. He stood at her hip. He looked down at the valley too. She said very quietly, "Copper, we have to go." She went back inside. She banked the fire, wrapped her feet in extra strips of wool, put on every coat she owned, and picked up her iron digging tool. She stepped out. She began step by step to break a path down the mountain. You have seen in your life ordinary people do things that were not ordinary. If you have, you know what I mean when I say that Elspeth did not think of herself as a rescuer that morning. She thought of herself as a widow of the Ashcroft family walking down the hill to check on her husband's parents. Nothing more. She did not think of the wagers. She did not think of the sermon. She did not think of Bartholomew Crane's dire report. She thought only of the dark chimney. She thought only that Nathaniel would have gone. So she went. The walk that in October had taken 20 minutes took her almost 2 hours. Each step had to be tested. She drove the handle of the digging tool ahead of her into the drift before she trusted her weight to the ground beneath. She fell 3 times. She got up 3 times. Copper trotted behind her along the trench. She was breaking his brown coat bright against the snow. She reached the Ashcroft porch just past 10 in the morning. She could hear nothing inside. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. A chair scraped faintly across a wooden floor. The door opened 4 inches. Cordelia Ashcroft stood in the gap. She was wrapped in 3 shawls. She was gray in the face. Her breath came out in a visible cloud inside her own house. Cordelia said, "Elspeth." Elspeth said, "Where is Silas?" Cordelia's face crumpled. She said, "By the fireplace. He will not admit it, but he can barely stand." Elspeth stepped in. The parlor was as cold as a barn. The fire was out. There was no wood in the wood box. Silas Ashcroft was in his armchair wrapped in a blanket. His head was down. When he looked up, Elspeth saw a man 10 years older than the one she had left in October. He said hoarsely, "Cordelia," who was at the door. Cordelia said, "It is Elspeth." He stared at her. He did not have the strength to be proud. She said, "How much wood?" He said, "None. The pile is buried. The chimney is blocked." She said, "How many people are in this house?" He said, "Cordelia, me, Wesley." Elspeth said, "Get your coats, all 3 of you, now." Silas opened his mouth. Whatever he had been going to say did not come out. He closed his mouth again. He nodded. Cordelia disappeared toward the back rooms. That was when the fourth person came out. He came slowly from the hallway at the back of the parlor wrapped in a heavy quilt. He was young, 22, 23. He had Nathaniel's eyes. Wesley Ashcroft stopped in the middle of the parlor floor. He looked at Elspeth. His mouth trembled. He said, "Elspeth, I have to give you something." She said, "Not now, when we are warm. Get your coat." He said, "Please, please listen." She stopped. He turned. He walked back into the hallway. He walked to his own bedroom door. He was gone for a moment. He came back holding an envelope. It was yellowed. It had been folded. It had been folded and unfolded many times. He walked back to her. He said, "This is Nathaniel's last letter to you, from his own hand. He asked me the night before he died to save it before Ma could reach the desk. I did save it, but then I hid it. In my own room for 3 months, I read it many times. I did not have the courage to bring it up the mountain. I placed a wager against you. I stood in the tavern and mocked you. I have been the worst kind of coward, Elspeth. And I am asking you now in the ruin my own family has made of this house to take this letter. Read it or don't read it, but it is yours. It has always been yours." He pressed the envelope into her hand. She stared at it. Cordelia came back with 3 coats over her arm. She saw the envelope. She stopped where she stood. Silas struggled to his feet. He said hoarsely, "Wesley." Wesley did not look at his father. He looked at Elspeth. He said quietly, "Nate told me, before he died, he told me to protect you. He said if Ma and Pa turn on her, you protect her, because she is the one who knows how to live through what's coming. He said, read our grandfather Bjorn's journal if you don't believe me." He was right, and I failed him. But I could not in the end let this letter stay hidden. That is the one small piece of decency in me. Please. Elspeth held the envelope. She did not open it. She looked at Silas. She said, "We will go up the mountain now, all 4 of us. There will be time for letters when we are warm." Silas Ashcroft looked at his daughter-in-law. For the first time in his life, he did what a woman told him to do. He nodded. He said yes. They wrapped Cordelia in every blanket in the house. They wrapped Silas. They wrapped Wesley. Elspeth led. Copper trotted at the end of the small procession, watching every step. The climb back up the ridge over ground she had already broken with her tool took almost 2 hours. Silas fell twice. Wesley picked him up both times the second time, with a strength no one including Wesley had realized he had. When they reached the mouth of the cave and Silas Ashcroft put his hand on the cedar wall, his daughter-in-law had built and felt the steady warmth of a place made by human hands to defy a storm the size of a country. He did something no one who had ever known him would have believed possible. He put his forehead against the wood, and he wept. Elspeth touched his shoulder very gently. She said, "Come inside, Father." She had never called him that before. He looked up at her, and his mouth worked, and he could not speak. She led him through the small door. She led all three of them through. Inside the cave was 51 degrees. The fire outside was banked low. The natural chimney at the back drew steady and clean. The clay floor was dry. There were 3 good wool blankets folded on the shelf. There was hot broth in the black iron pot waiting. Copper came in behind them. He shook the snow from his coat and sat down between Silas and the fire as if to make sure the old man understood he was safe now. Elspeth ladled broth into 3 tin cups. She handed them out one at a time. Nobody spoke. The wind outside was still. The sun outside was thin and pale. Down in the valley, the smoke from the surviving chimneys drifted up in slow, unhurried threads. Cordelia Ashcroft, sitting on a blanket near the fire, looked at Elspeth. Her lips trembled. She said quietly, "You came for us." Elspeth said yes. Cordelia lowered her head. She pressed the tin cup against her forehead. Her shoulders shook. Silas said, and his voice was rough and honest and old, "Elspeth, I owe you a debt no man in this county could pay in a lifetime." He paused. He said, "I have to say some things. I do not have the right to say them. But I have to say them because if I die tonight, I want to die with them said. I sent you up this mountain to break you, not to kill you, but to break you. I knew this stone. I knew what it could do. I mined it in this very hill when I was 24 years old. I knew a person of skill could make a home here. I did not believe you had that skill. I believed you were a soft Ohio girl and that the winter would send you crawling back to my porch by December. I wanted the whole valley to see you crawl. I wanted the whole valley to see me refuse you. That is who I have been, Elspeth. That is the truth about me." He stopped. He was breathing hard. He said, "And you have brought me into the very shelter I meant to use to humiliate you. And you have given me broth from a pot my own son gave you as a wedding gift, and you have called me father, and I do not know how to sit inside that fact. I do not know how." Elspeth crossed the cave. She knelt down in front of him. She took the tin cup from his hands. She set it aside. She put both of her hands over his. She said quietly, "Then we will learn how together later. Right now, drink the broth." He drank the broth. Cordelia, watching, made a small, broken sound and put her face into her hands. Wesley sat by the mouth of the cave with his eyes on the fire. He looked at Elspeth once. He nodded once. Then he lowered his head. Nobody spoke again for a very long time. Sometimes silence is what a room needs more than any words. Later, when the fire outside had been built back up and the cave was warm, and the Ashcrofts were sleeping under wool blankets like 3 tired children, Elspeth sat cross-legged near the doorway. She held Nathaniel's letter in her hand. She had not yet opened it. Copper was against her hip. She looked at the envelope for a long time, then she broke the seal. The letter was written in her husband's careful, tall hand, the same hand from the 2 years of letters that had drawn her across half a country. It said, "My dearest Elspeth, if you are reading this, I am gone, and my brother Wesley has kept the small promise I begged of him, and I am in his debt across the veil. I want you to know some things so that you can carry them with you. My parents did not want to love you, but you were not a nurse to me. You were the first thing in my life aside from my brother Wesley that I chose for myself. Every letter I wrote to you in the second year I wrote as myself. I believe you knew this. I hope you knew. I want you to know that I read my grandfather Bjorn's journal, the one you carried with you in your trunk. I read it in the afternoons when you thought I was sleeping. I read every page. I understood what he had written. And I understood that you, Elspeth, are the only person who has been under this roof in the last 20 years who knows what those pages mean. My father is a proud man. He was once a man of stone. He has spent 30 years pretending he was only ever a man of soil. When he learns that you have taken his own limestone and made a home of it, he will either break or he will be reborn. I do not know which. Both are possible. I want you to know that Wesley loves you already, though he does not know how to show it. He is only 22. Give him time. He will find his courage. He is my brother, and there is good in him. I want you to know that I am not sorry that I wrote to you. I am only sorry that I did not have longer to be your husband. Grandfather Bjorn used to say, Stein Husker Sommern. Stone remembers summer. I have thought about that many times in these last months. I think it means, my Ellie, that the good things we are given do not vanish when the season turns cold. They wait deep in the rock for the person patient enough to draw them out. Be that person, Elspeth, in every way. I love you. Your husband always, Nathaniel. She read it twice. Then she folded it. She pressed it against her chest. For the first time since October, she wept. Quietly, so as not to wake the sleeping. Copper lay across her feet the way he had lain across Nathaniel's feet the day her husband died. Outside the cave, the sun was going down behind the ridge, and in the valley below, the surviving families of Hollow Ridge were one by one discovering the extent of what had happened to them, and one by one learning that the widow they had wagered against was now the safest human being on their mountain. There is more to tell. There is much more to tell, because the story of what Elspeth Thorvaldsen did in the days and weeks that followed, and the story of what she built in the years after that, and the story of what the world eventually learned about her cave is a story that changed a whole corner of the Ozarks. Stay with me, friend, all the way to the end. The next morning, Elspeth put her coat back on. The sun was up. The wind had died. The sky was the pale glass-clear blue that follows a great cold. Silas was awake. He sat wrapped in a blanket by the fire, holding the tin cup between his hands. She said, I am going back down. There are other houses. He said, I will come with you. She said, no, you will stay here with Cordelia. You will keep the fire steady. You will drink the second pot of broth when it is ready. Wesley will come with me. Silas looked at his younger son. Wesley was already standing. Wesley had his boots on. Silas nodded once. Elspeth and Wesley went down the mountain together along the trench she had broken the day before with Copper trotting between them. They spoke very little on the way down. There was very little to say. What needed to be said between them would be said later in the years after, in the small, unhurried ways forgiveness gets said in real life. At the bottom of the ridge, they turned east toward the Halloway house because it was the closest and because a plume of very thin, very weak smoke was rising from what was left of it. Prudence Halloway opened the kitchen door with a bread knife in her hand. She had not slept in 4 nights. Her hair was down. Her face was blotched. When she saw Elspeth, she began to cry. She said, oh dear God, I was so wrong. Elspeth said, Prudence, there is a warm place, come. They brought out Prudence and her husband and her 2 daughters. The youngest, a girl of 7 named Ellen, had a small blackened patch on her cheek that Elspeth recognized as the beginning of frostbite. She wrapped the child in her own scarf. She carried her herself up the ridge, in her own arms, with Wesley taking the older girl on his back. They came back down again after that. They pulled a hired hand named Jonah out of a collapsing barn. They pulled a widow named Miriam Stern out of a kitchen in which the stove had gone out on the second day. They pulled Reverend Josiah Pembroke out of his own front hall. He was lying on the floor. The last of his firewood was ash. He had wrapped himself in altar cloths. When he saw Elspeth's face, he tried to speak. He could not at first. Then he whispered, I was a fool. God forgive me. You were the light of the world, and I called you darkness. She said, Reverend, save your strength. We are going up the mountain. They brought him up. They pulled Bartholomew Crane, still lodged in the Ashcroft farmhouse's spare guest room, out into the cold. He was fine physically, but he had been sleeping under 7 blankets for 3 days. When Elspeth put out her hand and helped him to his feet, he stared at her for a long moment. He said quietly, Madam, I owe you a report, a very different one from the one I filed. She said, you can write it later, Mr. Crane. Right now we walk. She and Wesley and Copper made 4 trips up and down that ridge on the 5th of January, 1888. By dusk, the cave held 11 people. 11. Silas and Cordelia, Wesley, Prudence and her husband and their 2 daughters, Jonah the hired hand, Miriam Stern, Reverend Pembroke, Bartholomew Crane, Elspeth made 12, Copper made 13. The cave which she had built for one person to survive held them all. Not comfortably, but warm through the whole of that night and the next night and the night after that. She kept the outside fire steady. She rationed the broth. She melted snow for water. She organized the sleeping in shifts. She sent Wesley and Jonah out 3 times to bring in more firewood from a stack she had prepared in October. She checked twice each night the cedar wall, running her fingers along every joint. The wall held. On the second night, Bartholomew Crane sat by the fire with a small brass thermometer he had taken from his engineer's kit. He measured the interior temperature. He measured the exterior. He wrote both figures down in a small notebook. He looked up at Elspeth. He said, 53 degrees, ma'am, in this cave. 38 below outside. That is a differential of 91 degrees. In a shelter with a single low fire. Ma'am, I have been in the business of shelters my entire adult life. I have never in my life seen a 91-degree differential in a structure not powered by mechanical means. I have never seen it. Not in Chicago, not in New York, not in any book I have read. She smiled. She said, my grandfather Bjorn saw it every winter of his life. In the mines of Telemark in Norway, the men worked in shirt sleeves through the coldest months because the stone at depth was always the same temperature. He said the stone remembers summer. He said the summer is still down there waiting. Bartholomew Crane wrote that phrase down in his notebook. Stone remembers summer. He underlined it. On the third morning, Reverend Pembroke, whose fingers were wrapped in strips of clean muslin, asked Elspeth if he could speak. She said, of course, Reverend. He said, Sister Ashcroft, I preached against you from my pulpit. I told my flock that you practiced heathen ways. I closed my doors to you. And in the end, when the winter came for me, you came for me. You did what my Lord commanded I do, and you did it while I was too proud to do it. In the memory of your husband and in the memory of my own better self, I will spend the rest of my ministry making that right. I cannot undo it, but I can say it in front of all these people. I was wrong. I was completely, terribly wrong. And Elspeth Thorvaldsen Ashcroft is the finest Christian woman I have ever known. Cordelia in the corner quietly began to cry again. Silas held her hand. Elspeth crossed the cave. And she knelt down beside Reverend Pembroke. She looked at his wrapped fingers. She said, Reverend, save your strength. There will be many sermons yet. He smiled. He nodded. The storm ended on the 8th of January. The snow began to soften on the 10th. The road down to Berryman's Crossing became passable on the 15th. By the end of January, the story of what had happened on Ashcroft's Ridge was known in every farmhouse for 3 counties. The valley began slowly to climb the mountain. They came in 2s and 3s at first. Farmers who had lost roofs, widows who had spent the storm on their kitchen floors, young couples who had been in need and were now in the shock of survival, in a hurry to marry and start a family and prepare more seriously for the next winter. They came to Elspeth. They asked her plainly and humbly if she would teach them what she had done. She said yes. She said yes to every single one. By the end of March, she had drawn diagrams for 16 families. By the end of April, cedar walls were going up in front of 8 different limestone hollows across the county. By the end of May, Caleb Monroe had walked back up the ridge with his hat in his hand and said, Ma'am, I owe you an apology I cannot pay, but I would like to spend the rest of my working life apprentice to what you know, if you will have me. She said, Caleb Monroe, you were a good man then, and you are a good man now. Come and work. He worked with her for the next 4 years, teaching families in 3 counties how to read their own limestone and build their own doors. Silas Ashcroft in April walked into the county courthouse in Berryman's Crossing and formally transferred the entire Ashcroft farm to Elspeth. She refused. She said, give half of it to Wesley. He has earned it back. Give the other half to me. I will live in the cave. But the farm should be worked. Silas did as she asked. He lived another 11 years. Hoy and Cordelia spent the rest of their lives working the fields under their daughter-in-law's quiet management. They came to love her in their own careful, wounded way. She let them. In the winter of 1893, another great storm came through the Ozarks. It was not as long as the storm of '88, but it was as cold. Not a soul died in Hollow Ridge that year. Not one. The valley people came out of their newly built shelters in the mornings and looked up at the ridge and saw the thin, steady smoke of Elspeth's fire and understood without needing to say it what she had given them. Obadiah Finch's grave under the oak on Beecher's Knob became a small, quiet place of pilgrimage. Elspeth walked up to it every May when the dogwoods came out. She left a small stone from the cave on the top of the mound. She would sit for a while. She would tell the old man what the mountain had been doing. In the fall of 1892, when Elspeth was 31 and still living in the cave, and when the whole valley had by then made its peace with her, she married Caleb Monroe. He was 29. He had been apprenticed to her work for 4 years, and it had become clear to both of them slowly and without any grand announcement that they wanted the rest of their lives to happen in the same room. They were married on a warm October afternoon under the great oak on Beecher's Knob, near where Obadiah Finch was buried. Reverend Pembroke, whose two ruined fingers had by then become a matter of quiet pride to him, performed the ceremony. He said it was the finest wedding he had ever presided over. He said it 3 times. They had 3 children together, 2 boys and a girl. The girl they named Ingeborg for Elspeth's mother. The boys they named Nathaniel and Bjorn. Nathaniel Monroe grew up to be a limestone mason and worked his mother's technique into stone shelters across 3 states. Bjorn Monroe became a school teacher in Berryman's Crossing and taught 2 generations of Ozark children the difference between limestone and sandstone. Ingeborg Monroe in her time became a writer, and she is the one who eventually recorded most of what you have heard in this story from her mother's own mouth in a small, quiet parlor in the winter of 1932. Copper died peacefully in 1899, curled at Elspeth's feet by the outside fire on a warm September evening. She buried him under the oak, too, beside Obadiah. She said his name aloud 3 times into the summer wind. He had been 15 years old, an unusually long life for a working collie, and Ingeborg, who was 6, kept his brown leather collar in a wooden box on the mantelpiece until the end of her own long life. Elspeth Thorvaldsen Ashcroft Monroe died in the winter of 1933. She was 72 years old. She died in the cave. She had said her wish, and none of her children argued with her about it. Wesley Ashcroft, who was by then a gray-haired man of 68, was the one who dug her grave under the same oak where Obadiah and Copper lay, and where a few years later he would be buried too. The cave itself outlasted her by a very long time. It is still there. If you drive out to that stretch of Missouri now, and you know who to ask, you can find the trail. The cider wall has been carefully preserved by a local historical society. Some of the original logs from 1887 are still in place. The clay and moss chinking has been replaced many times, always by the same technique. The natural chimney at the back still draws clean. The temperature inside in the deepest part still holds between 52 and 56 degrees, summer and winter alike. The way limestone always has, and the way limestone always will. Some decades later, when university researchers came out to study old earth-sheltered dwellings across the Ozarks, they measured what Elspeth had built. They wrote down the numbers in careful academic prose. They said in effect what her grandfather Bjorn had said in a dirt yard in Telemark 100 years before them. That limestone at depth holds a steady temperature. That a well-sealed doorway can retain the great majority of a shelter's heat. That a small fire banked against a curved arrangement of stone can, through the physics of thermal mass, warm a chamber for a full night without the smoke ever entering the living space. The researchers, when they walked out of the cave into the summer sun, did what people always do when they discover something like this. They shook their heads. They laughed a small, wondering laugh. One of them, a young woman with a clipboard, said, quietly to no one in particular, "How on earth did she know?" The old man from the Historical Society, who was showing them around, said gently, "She didn't have to know, ma'am. Her grandfather did. Sometimes wisdom skips a generation. It skips a whole valley. And then a widow comes along who is willing to sit down and read the journal. Nobody else bothered with, and to build the thing everyone else laughed at. And that's how a whole town gets to live through a 100-year storm." Above the mouth of the cave over the door, into a smooth spot on the limestone, Elspeth had once in the year of her marriage to Caleb Monroe carved a small line of letters in her grandfather's language. You can still see it if you know where to look. It says, "Steinhusker Sommeren. Stone remembers summer." If this story stayed with you, my friend, hold on to that phrase for a little while today. Because the truth of it is not really about limestone. The truth of it is that the good things we have been given by the people who loved us, the songs, the recipes, the prayers, the small handed down pieces of wisdom, they are still in us. They are still deep in the stone of us. And in a hard season when the world grows cold, they are still there waiting for a woman patient enough to reach in and draw them out. Elspeth was such a woman. You may be too. If this story moved you, would you take one small kindness and share it with a woman you love? A mother, a sister, a friend, somebody who has at some point in her own long winter been told she was less than she was. Tell her this story. Tell her about the cave and the widow and the little red and the letter under the false bottom of the drawer. And tell her from me that Stone remembers summer, and so does she. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. If you would like to hear more true-hearted stories of the American frontier and of the quiet women who kept whole valleys alive, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I will meet you next week by another fire. Until then, keep warm, keep the ones you love close, and do not ever let anyone tell you that the cave they gave you was meant to be your grave. It might just be your home.